The Illuminating Diary. Mine and Arthur Munro's long and fruitless search for clues regarding the infamous Martins family had nearly driven us to abandon the effort altogether, when a faint plume of smoke caught Arthur's eye. It rose lazily above the treetops of Cone Mountain. Having examined the nearby squatter settlement on more than one occasion, it felt almost as if the smoke was mocking our desperation, or indeed that this haunted countryside so proved to us that it could easily hide its secrets under our very noses. We followed it through the tangled woods until we came upon a sagging cabin, hidden away from the rest of the world. The dilapidated hut was scarcely more than a pile of rotting timbers, half swallowed by creeping vines. Inside, a flicker of movement betrayed the presence of its occupant, a figure who regarded us coldly from the shadows. He was gaunt, bent with age, yet there was something in his pallid, almost sickly face that spoke of a history older than the forest around us. His eyes, though weary, gleamed with a pale, faintly bluish hue that unsettled me from the moment I met his gaze. He invited us inside without questions, and with only the barest of greetings, as if every spoken word was a heavy chore. The old squatter acted as if he somehow had expected us, as indeed he might have, given that we had been rummaging about the countryside for weeks. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, as though he had repeated this ritual many times before, leading curious outsiders to the brink of some terrible revelation. Arthur, ever the pragmatist, seemed focused on our investigation and did our usual explanation, but I could feel something deeper pulling at my mind. A sickening sense of anticipation gripped me as we entered the dimly lit room, where the air hung thick with the musty scent of decay. The man's gaze lingered on me, and I could feel the weight of it, as though he saw something he recognized there. Without a word, as Arthur finished, he turned toward the hearth, his thin fingers tracing the stonework until they came to rest on a loose slab. With an odd motion, he dislodged the stone, revealing a hidden cavity behind it. From this dark recess, he pulled a weathered, leather-bound manuscript, old, fragile, and humming with the weight of untold horrors. I tried to speak, but found that my throat had gone dry. Even Arthur, always the more collected of the two of us, seemed out of words at the possibility of an actual clue materializing. The man held it out to me, without any words of explanation, his old bluish eyes filled with something akin to pity. The manuscript was brittle, the pages stained with age, yet the words were legible, sharply etched by a hand that did not seem to be a habituate writer. At first, the entries spoke of mundane life, Gerrit Martins, the family patriarch's doings, the construction of the mansion, and other secular items. My attention piqued, however, when I inspected a page that mentioned markers, possibly of some Indian descent, that had been found in the deepest stretch of forest still on the property. Apparently, the markers, being made of stone and seeming very old, were placed around a small stream emanating from a crevasse high on Tempest Mountain. Gerrit Martins, ever the ambitious and arrogant man, dismissed any warning that might be connected to the sinister-appearing markers, ordering their immediate removal. The mundane retelling then continued, but later the writer described how, over the years, the Martins family began to transform, slowly, imperceptibly at first. They had always been a family of dark-eyed men and women, with rich, deep brown eyes that gleamed with vitality. But after their arrival in this strange and ancient land, their eyes, or frequently only a single one, began to pale. By the time of Gerrit's grandchildren, the odd family trait had stabilized. Apparently, a new hand, with even worse writing, now spoke through the pages. It spoke of a change in all the family, with a mixture of confusion and dread. The family began to exhibit new changes: mood swings, heightened senses, strange dreams of dark places and ancient carvings. And then there was the stream mentioned again. The diary recorded in vivid detail the first taste of the water: cold, bitter, but strangely invigorating. They drank it in secret, at first convinced it was a gift from the earth, a reward for their conquest of the land. But as the years passed, the water's effect grew. Our eyes grew sharper, clearer, the diary read, but the world seemed to darken around us. Our blue eye began to see things in the night, shapes that moved in the trees, whispering from the shadows, and always the stream. It called to us, urging us back to its depths. Johann Martens, the family head at the time, had somehow managed to seal the stream and covered up its origin. The family hated him for that, and the few that sided with Johann began to fear for their safety. The other Martens materialized a love for hunting and had taken to eating their prey undercooked or even raw. My heart raced as I read on, each passage more unsettling than the last. The writer spoke of how he and a few others had tried to distance themselves from the others, but it was too late. The clear blue eye that had once marked their pride now glowed with an unnatural light, and their minds began to unravel. Some of the family and most of the staff had left for the mountains, hoping to carve a brighter future. In the final passage, the diary read, "I must flee lest I suffer the same fate as Jan." I closed the manuscript with trembling hands, its revelations swirling in my mind. The old squatter sat in silence, his eyes gleaming in the flickering light of the hearth. He needed to say nothing. The knowledge had already taken root in me, burrowing deep into my thoughts, like the stream's taint had in the Martins' bloodline. Arthur, ever the pragmatist, asked no questions as we left the cabin, but I could feel his unease beside me. He could not understand the growing obsession that had seized me, the insatiable thirst to know more, to uncover the truth of that accursed stream and the terrible legacy it had wrought. As we made our way back through the darkened woods, I cast one last glance over my shoulder. The old man remained at the doorway, his pale eyes following me like the lingering gaze of the dead. Even though the following day's exhaustive search atop Tempest Mountain revealed nothing of a stream, I knew with a dreadful certainty that I could not turn away from the path I had chosen. The Spelunker. The expedition to Tempest Mountain had begun with little more than idle curiosity, a new conquest to add to an already considerable line of impressive accomplishments. The rumors that had reached the ears of the famous spelunker, Van Doren, were of the usual kind. Local superstitions whispered warnings and tales too strange to be believed. But the story of a cave system newly exposed by some kind of wild explosion intrigued him. The idea of unexplored pristine depths hidden beneath the mountain was irresistible. Van Doren had dismissed the warnings easily enough. Stories of wild apes haunting the mountain meant little to him and his seasoned team. Still, the cave explorer had made sure they were prepared. Each of them carried automatic weapons and extra ammunition. Any animal that stood in their way would have to face the consequences. The group set out early from the hotel at Lefferts Corner, forming a small caravan of cars, as their numbers had been increased by a few sturdy locals. As they left the cars and entered the steep hillside, the group's mood became gradually more suppressed. None could help but notice the twisted surroundings, especially the overgrown trees that seemed to ooze malevolence. The youngest among them, a reporter from one of the largest newspapers, seemed nervous but eager, thrilled at the chance to document an adventure that would surely make headlines. Van Doren led the way, his eyes scanning the rugged landscape with the practiced gaze of a man who had spent his life conquering depths that others feared to approach. The entrance to the cave system was crude and jagged, the result of an explosion that had torn open the earth itself. The outermost chamber had been only partly explored, as not even the bravest local dared to venture more than a few feet inside, but it was said that after a small distance, the cavern seemed to plunge deep into the heart of the mountain. The locals began to set up the camp, and as it was still early and a fine day, Van Doren's men wasted no time preparing the descent, fastening ropes and harnesses. The journalist insisted on taking a few shots with his speed graphic in front of the opening, and all obliged. Van Doren assumed one of his most heroic poses. At first, the descent was familiar to them all, cool, damp air, and the echo of their boots against stone. The walls of the cave were rough, jagged, and seemed to close in as they climbed deeper into the bowels of the mountain. Each of the climbers, save the journalist, moved with the confidence of men accustomed to danger, but the further they went, the more the air seemed to change. The cold became more biting, the silence oppressive. After some time, they noticed something most unexpected. The jagged walls of the cave smoothed out, and Van Doren's sharp eyes saw something definitely man-made. Steps, small and narrow, carved into the rock itself. The steps were uneven, almost too shallow for a man's foot. But as they had already descended most of the length of their ropes, they untied themselves from the ropes and proceeded using the steps. After considerable time carefully threading the meandering steps, with the weak light from the surface growing ever more distant, they seemed to have reached the bottom. Van Doren's senses were alert, his every step measured. He could not deny a feeling of unease, but it paled next to his curiosity. The chamber they entered was unlike anything they had seen before, its walls unnaturally smooth, as though they had been carved with exacting precision. Strange symbols adorned the walls, their meaning unknown, but they seemed to pulse with a quiet menace. The cave floor was smooth, but made somewhat precarious by a thick layer of animal bones that cracked under their feet as they moved. In the center of the room, a pool of dark water lay still, its surface undisturbed and glassy, barely reflecting the light of their lanterns. Thirst gnawed at them, though none could explain why. The air had grown oppressive, thick with moisture, and the sight of the water was a temptation. Van Doren approached the pool first, his mind momentarily clouded by the simple need to quench his thirst. He knelt beside it, dipping his hands into the cool, dark water. It was bitter and cold on his tongue, unlike any water he had tasted before, but it slaked his thirst. Some of the others hesitated, their unease growing as they stared at the foreign tokens on the walls. But Van Doren seemed unaffected. They drank deeply and felt strangely invigorated. The air in the chamber grew heavier still. It was as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting. The team's nerves were fraying, and a sense of urgency filled them. The descent had been long, too long, and they decided unanimously to turn back, their curiosity now replaced with a gnawing sense of dread. The journalist reminded them, with muted-sounding voice, of the need for photography to appease his paper, who had bankrolled the expedition. Although none were inclined, Van Doren acquiesced, and they gathered in front of the still pool. The lanterns carefully placed around the pool cast flickering shadows on the swirling symbols. The reporter fumbled with his camera, hands trembling as he adjusted the lens and prepared the flashbulb. The others stood waiting impatiently, their faces tight with unease. The camera clicked, the flashbulb bursting with sudden brilliance, flooding the chamber with harsh, artificial light for a split second. In that moment, the cave seemed to recoil, as if the mountain itself had been startled from a deep and ancient slumber. A moment of silence followed, but then small chilling sounds were heard from all around the vast chamber. The group gave out shouts of surprise and fright, and scrambled to fetch their lanterns. Van Doren's hand instinctively went to the automatic pistol at his side. Could it be bats, rats, or even the ill-rumored apes that they had disturbed? What he saw in the bleak light of his lantern, however, made him cry out with abject fear. An organic mass, indistinct but immense, surged forward toward them. Shots were fired, but to no more avail than shooting at the sea. A man tumbled backwards into the pool and was gone. Another was drawn to the ground. The remaining group panicked and started to shoot wildly. Van Doren, his heart racing, shouted orders, but his voice was lost in the cacophony of newfound terror. The others scattered, their lanterns knocked to the floor, leaving the chamber in near-total darkness. Van Doren's breaths came fast and shallow as he turned, desperate to locate his remaining men, but the darkness had become a living thing, consuming everything around him. Shapes moved in the shadows, hunched and grotesque, their forms barely visible as they closed in. Van Doren turned toward the steps, his mind racing, but his lifelong discipline still coming to his aid. They had left their ropes tied at the edge of the stone steps. If he could reach them, he could climb back to the surface, back to safety. His legs moved instinctively, the memory of the cold, bitter water still clinging to his throat as he made his way to the steps. But as he neared the base of the steps, something blocked his path. In the dim light, he could see them now, forms that had not been there before, waiting at the foot of the steps, blocking the way out. They were hunched, twisted, vaguely human in shape, but their bodies were covered in matted fur, their limbs unnaturally long. And then he saw their eyes, those terrible eyes. Each creature had one eye of piercing blue, cold and gleaming like the sky at dusk. The other was a deep, muddy brown. There was no sound, no growl or snarl, only the heavy, oppressive silence as the creatures stood watching, their mismatched eyes reflecting the faint lantern light. Hands shaking. He raised his gun, but he knew it was futile. The creatures moved with a terrible grace, closing the distance between them in a matter of seconds. In the silence that followed, as the darkness closed in around him, he understood that whatever had been sealed, dormant and starving within the depths of Tempest Mountain was now, once again, free